you can help.
For 25 years, John Humble here thought that he'd got away with one of the biggest hoaxes in history when he convinced the world that he was the Yorkshire Ripper. It would take years of police work and a huge leap forward in science before detectives finally got a chance to put him behind bars. Matthew has got the inside story.
The body was found here in the ground.
Anyone who thinks they recognise the voice is asked to ring the Ripper's call.
Police admit that so far they've had very little evidence to go on.
The killings began in 1975. Women were being murdered with sickening barbarity. In just 3 years, 7 victims died at the hands of one man. No one doubted the Yorkshire Ripper would strike again. It was only a question of when and where.
By 1978, the manhunt for the Ripper was already one of the biggest in the history of British policing. And Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield was the detective the country was relying on to get a result.
We've got 4 in Leeds, 2 in Bradford, and 1 in Manchester.
George and his team had followed up hundreds of leads, interviewed thousands of suspects, but still desperately needed a breakthrough.
The pressure on George Oldfield to catch the murderer would have been absolutely immense and would have increased with the discovery of every new victim.
In March 1978, a letter landed on George's desk. Another arrived at the Daily Mirror. Both had a Sunderland postmark, and both had been signed Jack the Ripper.
Claiming to be the killer, he taunted police, saying they'd missed out one of his victims, a 26-year-old prostitute called Joan Harrison. Joan's murder had never been officially linked to the Ripper murders, despite similarities. It was enough to get George's attention, but not enough to convince him the letters were genuine, until a third arrived a year later. It too had a Sunderland postmark, but this time forensics would prove a link to Joan Harrison. The man who'd written the letter and the murderer both had the same blood group.
Once we tested the envelope, we knew that the person who'd licked the envelope was a B secretor, and this set off alarm bells, if you like, in that the first letter had mentioned Preston 75, which was believed to refer to the murder of Joan Harrison. And in that case, we knew that there was also a B secretor had left fluid at the scene there.
The third letter was to change the whole course of the investigation. Now, George had far more than just a hunch. He had forensic evidence that suggested the killer and the writer were the same man.
3 months later, a tape arrived from Sunderland. It was addressed personally to George Oldfield.
I'm Jack. I have the greatest respect for you, George, but Lord, you are no nearer catching me now than 4 years ago when I started.
George needed to respond, so with handwriting analysis and forensics proving the tape was from the same letter writer, he hoped that someone, somewhere, would now recognise the voice.
Reporters assembled from all over the country to hear the taped voice of a man who claims he's killed 11 women.
Anyone who thinks they recognise...
Hundreds of people called in saying they recognised the voice. This generated thousands of actions for the investigation team.
Voice experts narrowed down the accent to Castletown, a tiny mining village near Sunderland. The whole investigation shifted to the northeast. It seemed like the police were finally closing in on the Ripper. Then, in September, just as the tape had predicted, another victim was found.
Maybe September, October.
George decided to draft guidance for all police forces across the country. The document said that anyone who didn't have a Geordie accent should be eliminated from the inquiries. Now, that had dire consequences and set in motion 2 very different reactions from 2 very different men. One man was now gaining in confidence, while the other grew more agitated as police started going door to door in his hometown.
Speak that, I can't hear you, it's a bad line.
It's a fake.
What's the fake?
The tape recorder.
Despite their best efforts, detectives were unable to trace the caller.
But little did they know this man was actually telling the truth. The letters and the tape had all been an elaborate hoax.
By now, the list of Ripper suspects was enormous. George and his team had got no further forwards.
With the pressures of the investigation, Mr. Oldfield's health had begun to suffer. He looked exhausted, but he wouldn't stop.
Later that year, George Oldfield suffered a heart attack and was finally forced to step down from the investigation. By 1981, police had spent around 2.25 million man-hours hunting for a killer who'd by now claimed 13 lives.